Spirits often seem to gravitate around locations that were meaningful to them during their earthly existence. Here, 4 Weird World viewers have shared their strange experiences of encounters with these location-based presences. Keep out. Dave says that he has had a few paranormal experiences in his life, but this is his most memorable. In 1981, he was a security officer on the American Air Force Base, RAF Lakenheath in England. He made friends with a few service members from the hospital unit, whose names were Antoinette or Tony and Phil. Tony lived off base at a residential outlier called RAF Feltwell. She told Phil and Dave about a weird phenomenon where she said she was held back by some invisible force and prevented from approaching an old abandoned house in the property next to the base. Dave and Phil were intrigued by this and a few weeks later visited the base and Tony's bungalow, planning to investigate the site. They walked towards the mansion and Tony was able to walk past the barrier that had held her back, but didn't want to go inside. They approached the house and went to the front door, which was locked, then walked around the perimeter of the house. There they found only a descending stairway to a basement door, and which was covered with a hinged iron grate level with the ground. They lifted up the heavy grate and leaned it against the side of the house, then descended to the basement door. With a little pressure, the door opened, and Dave and Phil entered the basement and were then able to mount steps to the first floor. The living room had furniture draped in sheets and a large oval mirror on the wall. Phil gave Dave a small hospital penlight to look around the place, then moved around downstairs while Dave went upstairs to explore. He went into a bedroom with pinkish paint on the walls and eerily began to notice something in his peripheral vision, the figure of an elderly woman in a lavender-coloured Victorian dress. Everywhere he turned, she was in his peripheral vision. Dave decided to speak, telling her that they wished her and her home no harm. He then headed downstairs to find Phil and leave. He found Phil shining his penlight on the oval mirror, and they both saw an image of a skull reflected in the light. They quickly decided to leave and tell Tony what they had found. A week later, Dave was having breakfast in the mess hall and he saw Phil approaching his table with his hand in a cast. Asked what had happened, Phil told him that he went back to the mansion alone to further investigate. He lifted the iron grate to enter the basement and again leaned the grate on the side of the house. As he descended down the stairs, he supported his descent with his hand on the side of the entrance. At that point, the iron grate came crashing down, breaking several bones in his hand. It really was as if a resident spirit did not want these intruders. My room. Gwendolyn Erasmus once shared a room with a ghostly resident at the Hydro Stellenbosch Health Spa in Cape Town. She arrived at the luxurious wellness mecca for a 3-day break, but the first thing she noticed was that the room allocated to her had a faint smell of urine. Ignoring it, she decided to speak to someone later. That night, she made sure that her windows were properly closed and the door locked. However, strangely while sleeping, she became aware that her duvet was being pulled down. Gwendolyn says that she can be quite stroppy about sleep deprivation. In her irritation, she yanked the duvet back up, but the same thing happened again as it was again dragged down. She then became quite fearful and opened her eyes to see what looked like a little old man sitting in a chair in the room. She quickly switched on the lights and there was nothing there. Now Gwendolyn was feeling petrified and so switched on the TV and just gazed at it until she felt sleepy. The next morning, she told the receptionist about the smell and asked to be moved to another room. She also told them about her experience and observed that the staff fearfully looked at one another. She says that they were Cape Town girls and she could see that they believed her. Gwendolyn later spoke about this experience at a meeting she attended. She says that a friend with a vast knowledge of that area stated that the location is supposed to be haunted by the founder and is also the former site of a Boer War concentration camp. Welcoming spirit. Whether a time slip experience or resident ghosts strongly attached to their former home, Mary says that her husband Michael had this vivid, interactive encounter. They were visiting a cabin that had been owned early last century by a famous frontiersman named Kootenai Brown. The pioneering soldier, trader and conservationist helped to develop Waterton National Park in Canada. Mary relates that her husband was in the kitchen of the cabin when all of a sudden he saw Kootenai Brown sitting in a chair in the kitchen. Kootenai's wife, Isabella, was cooking something on the stove, and astonishingly, Mary's husband could smell it. He said to the apparition before him, "I see you, Kootenai Brown," to which the ghostly Kootenai replied, "I see you too, Michael, and you are welcome here." Playful coachman. James Booth writes that in the winter of 1966, he was 17 and lived in Cheadle, Staffordshire in the UK. One afternoon after school, riding his BSA Bantam motorbike, he visited some school friends in the market town of Uttoxeter, which was about 9 miles away. The friends talked about the usual teenager stuff and got onto the topic of roads when one of James' friends, called George, told him some history of the area. He told him about the coach roads that used to meander across the countryside before modern roads. Eventually it became late and James headed home on the A50 back to Cheadle. However, there was a dense fog that night which hampered his progress, especially since he was unable to use his helmet visor, which picked up condensation from the fog. In addition, he wore glasses which also fogged up, so there he was after midnight on a lonely road with no street lights and no other traffic, rendered short-sighted with smudged glasses. He was precariously following the curb and the white line, going at about 25 miles an hour and risking running into something at that speed. Then a bizarre incident occurred. After a couple of miles, a black shape suddenly and silently shot in front of him from the left side, keeping in mind that motorists drive on the left in the UK. The object appeared to be something the size of a small box truck. James instinctively veered abruptly to the left to avoid it, and to his immediate surprise found himself in a muddy farmer's field. On inspecting where he was, he found that he had turned into the field through an open gate, and he could see no evidence of any kind of vehicle or tracks in the mud to make sense of what had just happened. James' first thought was that the universe was playing a trick on him. How strange was the coincidence that, having just been informed of the existence of coach roads and horse-drawn coaches, a ghost coach should run him off the road. Travelling the A50 on another occasion, he noticed that there were no other farmers' gates on that side of the road before the one he had gone through. Another weird coincidence was the fact that it had been left open, or perhaps had been opened, by the spectral coachman. If James had veered off the road anywhere else, he would have run into a solid hawthorn hedge or dropped into a drainage ditch. This would have definitely wrecked his bike, and he himself would most likely have been hurt and stranded in the wintry night. Remembering that this was years before cell phones, the situation could have been dire. When he told George about the incident, his friend replied that he believed that where James ended up had been a coach road leading to a stately home, long since demolished. James concluded that if it was a spirit driving a ghost coach, he was having fun playing a joke on him. He wonders if, after talking about coach roads and coaches from bygone ages that evening, he was run into the mud by a playful spirit coachman who perhaps wanted to make his presence known. Or maybe the ghost didn't appreciate noisy, smelly motorbikes. While seemingly keeping James safe perhaps, says James, he was making a cautionary gesture, to a kid who should have been home hours earlier.